The last thing Corinne Ashford remembered before the world went dark was the sound of her husband's voice, not screaming her name, not clawing through the debris to reach her, not begging God to let her survive, but calling out to another woman. She was pinned beneath a collapsed beam in what had been their kitchen, her left leg twisted at an angle that sent white-hot fire racing up her spine, and through the settling dust and the groaning of fractured walls, she heard Garrett shouting a name she had never heard before. Natasha. He screamed it with a desperation that Corinne had once believed he reserved only for her, for their children, for the life they had built together over 14 years of marriage. And then she heard his footsteps, not coming toward her, but moving away, scrambling over broken tile and shattered glass in the opposite direction, toward the guest wing of their home where, as Corinne would later learn, the woman he had been sleeping with for nearly 2 years had been visiting when the earthquake struck. He left her there. Her husband of 14 years, the father of her 2 children, the man who had promised before God and 137 wedding guests that he would love and protect her until death, chose in that moment of crisis to save the woman who had been destroying their family in secret. And Corinne, bleeding and broken beneath the ruins of the home she had poured her entire heart into building, was left alone in the dark to wonder if anyone would come for her at all. Before I continue this story, I want to ask you something from the heart. If you believe in kindness, if you believe that even in the darkest moments life can offer us second chances, if you believe that the people who are abandoned and forgotten can still rise and find their way back to the light, then please take a moment right now to like this video, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and subscribe to our channel. Every time you engage with stories like these, you help them reach someone else who might desperately need to hear them. You become part of our family, our community of people who believe that hope is never truly lost. So please, hit that subscribe button, share this with someone you love, and let us walk through this story together. Corinne Elise Ashford, born Corinne Elise Brennan, had grown up in a small town called Whitmore Falls in upstate New York, the kind of place where everybody knew everybody and where the changing of the seasons was the most dramatic thing that ever happened. She was the middle child of 3 daughters born to a high school English teacher named Lorraine and a postal worker named Gus, and from the time she was old enough to understand the concept, Corinne had believed fiercely and without reservation in the power of love. Not the shallow, performative kind that existed in romantic comedies and greeting cards, but the deep, bone-marrow kind that meant showing up every single day, even when it was hard, even when the person you loved made it difficult, even when the world gave you every reason to walk away. She had watched her parents model that kind of love for 31 years before her father passed away from pancreatic cancer, and she had carried that template into her own marriage like a sacred inheritance, something precious and irreplaceable that she was determined to honor. She met Garrett Ashford during her 2nd year of nursing school in Albany. He was finishing his MBA at the same university, a tall man with sharp features and an easy confidence that drew people to him like moths to a street lamp. He was charming in a way that felt effortless, the kind of person who could walk into a room full of strangers and leave with 5 new friends and 3 business cards. Corinne, who was quieter and more introspective by nature, had been drawn to his energy, to the way he seemed to move through the world without the weight of doubt or hesitation that she so often felt pressing down on her own shoulders. They dated for 2 years, got engaged on a rainy Sunday afternoon in October when the leaves in the park were burning gold and crimson, and married the following June in a small ceremony at the church where Corinne's parents had been married decades before. Their daughter Margot was born 13 months later, and their son Theo followed 3 years after that. For the first decade of their marriage, Corinne had genuinely believed they were happy. She worked part-time as a nurse at a pediatric clinic while Garrett climbed the corporate ladder at a financial consulting firm, eventually becoming a senior partner with a corner office and a salary that allowed them to buy a beautiful 4-bedroom house in the hills outside of Santa Rosa, California. They had dinner together most nights. They took family vacations to Lake Tahoe every summer. Garrett coached Theo's Little League team and attended Margot's piano recitals, and on their 10th anniversary he had surprised Corinne with a weekend trip to Napa Valley where they drank wine and walked through vineyards, and he told her, with what she believed was complete sincerity, that marrying her was the best decision he had ever made. She had cried. She had actually cried, right there in the tasting room with other couples milling around them, because she believed him. She believed every word. The cracks began appearing so gradually that Corinne almost didn't notice them, or perhaps more accurately, she noticed them but chose to interpret them as something other than what they were. Garrett started working later. He traveled more frequently for business. He became protective of his phone in a way he never had been before, carrying it with him everywhere, sleeping with it face down on his nightstand, excusing himself to take calls in another room. He became shorter with her, more impatient, more likely to sigh heavily when she asked him a simple question about his day. Corinne told herself it was stress. She told herself it was the pressure of his career, the weight of financial responsibility, the natural evolution of a long marriage. She told herself all of these things because the alternative, that the man she had built her entire life around was pulling away from her, was giving pieces of himself to someone else, was too devastating to contemplate. The earthquake struck at 11:40 in the morning on a Wednesday in early March, a 6.8 magnitude event that the seismologists would later say was the most powerful to hit the Northern California region in over 20 years. Corinne had been standing at the kitchen island, packing Theo's lunch for a field trip the next day. He was at school, Margot was at a friend's house, when the first jolt hit. The ground beneath her feet seemed to lurch sideways like the deck of a ship caught in a sudden storm, and she grabbed the edge of the counter as glasses and plates crashed from the open shelving above her. The shaking intensified with terrifying speed, a deep, grinding roar rising up from somewhere beneath the foundation of their home, and Corinne watched in frozen horror as the far wall of the kitchen buckled inward, the drywall splitting apart like paper, the wooden beams behind it snapping with sounds like gunshots. She tried to run. She made it 3 steps before the ceiling above her gave way, and a section of beam and plaster and roofing material came down on top of her, driving her to the ground with a force that expelled every molecule of air from her lungs and sent her consciousness flickering like a candle in a windstorm. She did not lose consciousness entirely, and that was perhaps the cruelest part. She was aware, painfully and horribly aware, of everything that happened in the minutes that followed. She was aware of the weight pressing down on her back and legs, the taste of dust and blood in her mouth, the distant wail of car alarms and the sharper, more immediate sound of their house continuing to settle and crack around her. She was aware of trying to scream, of managing only a thin, raspy cry that seemed to travel no farther than the pile of debris directly above her face. And she was aware, with a clarity that would haunt her for years afterward, of Garrett's voice somewhere in the house, shouting not her name but someone else's, and then his footsteps moving away from her, growing fainter, until they were swallowed by the chaos. What Corinne did not know, trapped there in the suffocating dark of her collapsed kitchen, was that Garrett had not been alone in the house when the earthquake struck. Natasha Prevost, a 29-year-old marketing associate at his firm, had been in the guest bedroom on the far side of the house, where she had apparently been spending time whenever Corinne was at work and the children were at school. This was a detail that would emerge later, pieced together from phone records and security camera footage and the reluctant confessions of mutual acquaintances who had known about the affair for months but had chosen to say nothing. On that Wednesday morning, Natasha had come to the house at Garrett's invitation while Corinne was supposed to be at the clinic, except that Corinne's shift had been cancelled at the last minute due to a staffing surplus, and she had come home early, unaware that her husband's mistress was tucked away in a room at the other end of the hall. The earthquake had struck before any confrontation could occur, before Corinne even knew another woman was in her home, and in the chaos that followed, Garrett had made his choice. He had gone to Natasha. Corinne lay buried for 19 hours before the search and rescue team found her. 19 hours of darkness, of pain so intense that it became almost abstract, a landscape of suffering that her mind could not fully map. She drifted in and out of consciousness, and during her waking moments she thought about her children, Margot, who was 12 and had her father's dark hair and her mother's stubborn chin, and Theo, who was 9 and still slept with a stuffed elephant named Captain even though he would deny it furiously if anyone asked. She thought about whether they were safe, whether their schools had held, whether someone was holding them and telling them everything would be okay. She thought about her mother, Lorraine, who was 73 now and living in a retirement community in Vermont, who would see the earthquake on the news and try to call and get no answer and feel the kind of terror that no parent should ever have to feel regardless of how old their child is. and she thought about Garrett. She thought about the sound of his voice calling another woman's name, and she felt something inside her chest that was separate from the physical pain, something deeper and more fundamental, a fracture not of bone but of belief, a crack running through the very foundation of everything she had understood her life to be. The rescue workers found her just after 6:30 the following morning, a team of 4 men and 2 women in orange vests and hard hats who moved the debris piece by piece with careful, methodical precision until they uncovered her battered body. She had a broken left femur, 3 fractured ribs, a collapsed lung, a concussion, and lacerations across her back and shoulders that would require over 60 stitches to close. She was dehydrated, hypothermic despite the mild California weather, and so covered in dust and dried blood that the paramedics initially could not determine her skin tone. But she was alive. Against all reasonable odds, against the weight of the rubble and the hours of exposure and the internal bleeding that the surgeons would later tell her came dangerously close to killing her, Corinne Ashford was alive. She woke up in the hospital 2 days later, which meant that 72 hours had passed since the earthquake, 72 hours during which the world had continued to turn and events had unfolded that would reshape her life in ways she could not yet imagine. The first face she saw was her sister Bridget's, red-eyed and exhausted and beautiful in the way that only someone who loves you desperately can be beautiful when you are at your worst. Bridget was holding her hand and crying and saying her name over and over, and behind her Corinne could see her other sister, Jeanette, standing by the window with her arms crossed and her jaw set in an expression that Corinne recognized as controlled fury. The children were safe, Bridget told her immediately, reading the question in Corinne's eyes before she could even form the words. Margot and Theo were with Lorraine, who had flown in from Vermont within hours of the earthquake. They were unharmed. They were okay. It was Jeanette who told her about Garrett. Not gently, because Jeanette had never been gentle about anything in her life, but directly and without embellishment, which was perhaps its own form of kindness. Garrett had pulled Natasha from the guest bedroom, which had sustained less structural damage than the kitchen, and had carried her out of the house through the garage, which was still partially intact. He had driven her to the hospital in his car, which had been parked in the driveway and had survived the quake with only a cracked windshield. He had stayed with her in the emergency room for 6 hours while she was treated for a broken wrist and minor cuts. He had called her family. He had held her hand. He had done all of the things for Natasha Prevost that he should have done for his wife, the woman who was lying buried and bleeding beneath the ruins of their shared home, the woman whose broken body was discovered by strangers almost a full day later because the man who was supposed to protect her had chosen not to. But the story did not end there, Jeanette continued, and here her voice took on a quality that was almost grim satisfaction. Because while Garrett was at the hospital with his mistress, the world was watching. A neighbor named Rosamund Holt, an elderly widow who lived 3 houses down and who had always been fond of Corinne, had seen Garrett carry Natasha out of the house. She had also seen the rescue teams arrive 19 hours later and pull Corinne from the rubble. And Rosamund, who was 78 years old and had survived her own share of betrayals and heartbreaks and had zero patience left for cowardice or cruelty, had told the story to a local news reporter who was covering the earthquake's aftermath. The reporter, sensing the kind of human interest angle that could define a career, had investigated. She had pulled together the timeline, the phone records, the testimony of the rescue workers, the hospital intake records showing that Garrett had checked Natasha in as his partner while his actual wife lay trapped and dying 3 miles away. The story had aired on the local evening news the night before Corinne woke up, and by the following morning it had gone national. Corinne learned all of this in pieces, fragments of information delivered between surgeries and medication adjustments and the slow, grinding work of physical recovery. She learned that Garrett's firm had terminated his partnership within 24 hours of the story breaking, not out of any particular moral conviction but because 3 of their largest clients had threatened to pull their accounts if Garrett remained associated with the company. She learned that their shared bank accounts had been frozen pending a legal review initiated by Garrett's own former colleagues, who were concerned about liability and reputation. She learned that Natasha Prevost had released a statement through a lawyer claiming that she had not known about the severity of Corinne's injuries and that she deeply regretted her involvement with a married man, a statement that convinced almost no one and infuriated almost everyone. And she learned, through Bridget, who handled the information with considerably more tenderness than Jeanette would have, that Garrett had tried to visit her in the hospital and had been turned away by the nursing staff, who had been instructed by Jeanette, a family law attorney with a backbone of reinforced steel, that he was not to be allowed within 50 feet of Corinne's room. The days in the hospital blurred together in a haze of pain medication and physical therapy and the constant, gentle presence of her sisters, who took turns sleeping in the recliner next to her bed so that she was never alone. Lorraine brought the children to visit on the 4th day, and Corinne held them as tightly as her broken ribs would allow, breathing in the familiar smell of Margot's strawberry shampoo and Theo's grass-stained jacket, and she made a decision in that moment that would define everything that followed. She decided that she was not going to be destroyed by this. Not by the earthquake, not by the injuries, not by the betrayal. She was going to survive, and she was going to rebuild, and she was going to do it not with bitterness or vengeance but with the same stubborn, bone-deep commitment to love that her parents had modeled for her entire life. She was going to do it for Margot and Theo, who deserved a mother who was whole and strong and unbroken by the cruelty of a man who had not deserved her. And she was going to do it for herself, because Corinne Ashford, Corinne Brennan, had been surviving things her entire life, and she was not about to stop now. The public response to the story was overwhelming in its scope and intensity. Within a week of the news breaking, a crowdfunding campaign organized by Rosamund Holt and several other neighbors had raised over $400,000 for Corinne's medical expenses and temporary housing. Letters and cards and packages arrived at the hospital by the dozens, then by the hundreds, from strangers across the country who had seen the story and been moved to reach out. A retired contractor in Sacramento offered to rebuild Corinne's home at cost. A women's shelter in San Francisco sent a delegation to offer counseling and legal support. A children's charity provided full scholarships for Margot and Theo's schooling. The outpouring was so vast and so immediate that it seemed to Corinne, in her more lucid moments, like the universe itself was trying to communicate something, that even when the people closest to you fail you in the most devastating way imaginable, there are others, strangers and neighbors and fellow travelers in this complicated human journey, who will step in to fill the void. Garrett, meanwhile, was unraveling. Stripped of his career, his reputation, and the carefully constructed image of respectability that had been his most prized possession, he seemed to crumble with a speed that surprised even those who knew him well. He moved into a motel on the outskirts of town after their house was condemned by the city's structural engineers. Natasha, unsurprisingly, ended their relationship within days of the story going public, retreating to her parents' home in Oregon and deleting all of her social media accounts. Garrett's own parents, Gerald and Patricia Ashford, who had always treated Corinne with warmth and genuine affection, released a statement expressing their heartbreak over their son's actions and their unwavering support for their daughter-in-law and grandchildren. Gerald, a retired Marine colonel who had spent 30 years in service to his country and held loyalty as the highest of all virtues, reportedly told Garrett in a phone call that he was ashamed to share a name with him, a conversation that multiple family members confirmed had reduced Garrett to tears. Corinne was released from the hospital after 3 weeks, though her recovery was far from complete. She moved into a rental house that Bridget had found and furnished in a quiet neighborhood closer to the children's schools, a modest but clean 3-bedroom with a small yard where Theo could play and a front porch where Corinne could sit in the morning sunlight and watch the neighborhood come alive. She attended physical therapy 3 times a week, working with a therapist named Phoebe who had the patient demeanor of a saint and the relentless optimism of someone who had seen far too many broken bodies put themselves back together to ever doubt the human capacity for healing. She saw a counselor, a calm and perceptive woman named Dr. Gretchen Farrow, who helped her begin the long and painful work of separating the trauma of the earthquake from the trauma of the betrayal, of learning to grieve the death of her marriage without allowing that grief to consume the life she was trying to rebuild. Jeanette filed for divorce on Corinne's behalf 6 weeks after the earthquake, and the proceedings were, by the standards of family law, remarkably swift and one-sided. Garrett, whether out of genuine remorse or the pragmatic recognition that public opinion had turned so thoroughly against him that contesting anything would only make his situation worse, did not fight. He agreed to full custody for Corinne, generous child support, the division of assets heavily in her favor, and the surrender of any claim to the insurance payout from their destroyed home. He signed every document Jeanette put in front of him without negotiation or complaint, and Corinne, watching from a distance as the legal architecture of their marriage was methodically dismantled, felt not triumph but a deep and aching sadness for the waste of it all. 14 years of shared history, of holidays and ordinary Tuesdays and the small, accumulating moments that make up a life together, all of it rendered meaningless by a choice he had made in the space of a few seconds on a Wednesday morning when the ground shook and the walls came down and he revealed, in the most visceral way possible, who he truly was. The months that followed were hard in a way that Corinne had not fully anticipated. The physical recovery was grueling. Her leg required a second surgery after the initial repair showed complications, and for weeks afterward she was confined to a wheelchair that made her feel diminished and dependent in a way that clawed at her sense of self. There were nights when the children were asleep and the house was quiet and the weight of everything pressed down on her with a force that rivaled the rubble that had once pinned her body, and she would sit in the dark kitchen and cry with the kind of raw, full-bodied weeping that left her feeling hollowed out and somehow lighter at the same time. There were mornings when she woke up and reached across the bed for a body that was no longer there, the muscle memory of 14 years so deeply encoded that her unconscious mind had not yet received the message that her marriage was over. And there were moments, sharp and unexpected, when she would see something, a particular shade of light falling through a window, a song playing in a grocery store, Theo making the same crooked half-smile that Garrett used to make, and the grief would ambush her with a ferocity that stole her breath. But there was also beauty. There was Margot, who at 12 was developing into a young woman of startling perceptiveness and quiet strength, who brought her mother tea without being asked and who wrote in a school essay that her hero was not a celebrity or a historical figure but her mom, who had survived being buried alive and had come out the other side still believing in the goodness of people. There was Theo, who dealt with the upheaval in his life by throwing himself into building elaborate Lego structures on the living room floor, sprawling cities and castles and spaceships that he narrated with a running commentary so detailed and imaginative that Corinne sometimes forgot her pain entirely, lost in the architecture of her son's boundless inner world. There was Bridget, who called every evening and visited every weekend and who had a talent for making Corinne laugh at exactly the moments when laughter felt most impossible. There was Rosamond, the elderly neighbor who had inadvertently set the chain of public accountability in motion, who came by every Thursday afternoon with homemade soup and stories about her late husband, Arthur, that were so vivid and so tenderly told that Corinne sometimes felt as though she knew him too. And there was, unexpectedly and without any planning or intention on Corinne's part, there was eventually healing. It did not arrive in a single dramatic moment, not as a lightning bolt of revelation or a cinematic turning point, but as a slow, incremental accumulation of small recoveries. The first time she walked without a cane. The first time she laughed without feeling guilty about it. The first time she looked in the mirror and saw not a victim but a survivor, not a woman who had been abandoned but a woman who had been set free. Dr. Farrow helped her understand that forgiveness was not something she owed Garrett, it was something she could choose to give herself, a release not of his guilt but of her own burden, the exhausting weight of carrying anger and betrayal in a body that had already borne more than its share of damage. It took time. It took months of therapy and honest self-examination and the willingness to sit with uncomfortable truths about her marriage that she had previously been too afraid or too loyal to acknowledge. But slowly, painstakingly, like a garden returning to life after a brutal winter, Corinne began to bloom. It was nearly a year after the earthquake, on a bright Saturday morning in February, that Garrett appeared at her front door. Corinne was in the kitchen, making pancakes for Margot and Theo, and when the doorbell rang she sent Margot to answer it, expecting the mail carrier or perhaps Rosamond with another pot of soup. Instead, Margot came back to the kitchen with an expression on her face that was equal parts uncertainty and barely contained anger, and she said 2 words, "Dad's here," in a tone that communicated far more than the words themselves. Corinne's first instinct was to refuse to see him. Her second instinct, which followed so closely on the heels of the first that they were almost simultaneous, was to recognize that she had spent a year building herself back up, that she was stronger now than she had been before the earthquake, before the betrayal, before any of it, and that she could face this man without being diminished by him. She told Margot to take Theo into the backyard and she walked to the front door, her gait still slightly uneven from the nerve damage in her left leg that the surgeons had warned her might be permanent, and she opened it. Garrett stood on the porch in the morning sunlight, and the sight of him hit her with a complicated wave of emotions that she would spend weeks unpacking with Dr. Farrow. He looked diminished. That was the word that came to her mind, diminished. He had lost weight, and not in a healthy way. His clothes were rumpled. There were dark circles under his eyes, and the confident, magnetic energy that had once defined him was gone, replaced by something smaller and more uncertain, like a light that had been dimmed to its lowest possible setting without being extinguished entirely. He told her he was sorry. He said it simply and without drama, standing on her porch with his hands hanging at his sides, and to Corinne's surprise she could see that he meant it, not in the performative way that she might have expected, not as a strategic maneuver designed to win sympathy or leverage, but with the raw and devastating sincerity of a man who had been forced to confront the full consequences of his actions and had found in that confrontation nothing to shield him from the truth of what he had done. He told her that he had lost everything, his career, his reputation, his relationship with Natasha, the respect of his parents, the trust of his children, and that he understood now that all of those losses were deserved, that they were the natural and inevitable result of the choice he had made on that Wednesday morning when the earth shook and he ran toward the wrong person. He told her that he did not expect her forgiveness, that he was not asking for reconciliation or a second chance, that he knew he had forfeited any right to those things in the moment he heard her crying beneath the rubble and chose to walk away. He said that he simply needed her to know that he was sorry, truly and completely sorry, and that if she would allow it, he would like the chance to be a better father to Margot and Theo, not to redeem himself, because he was not sure that redemption was possible for what he had done, but because his children deserved a father who at least tried to be worthy of them. Corinne stood in the doorway and listened, and when he was finished she was quiet for a long time. She looked at this man who had once been her whole world, this man she had loved with an intensity that now seemed almost foreign to her, like a memory belonging to someone else, and she felt something shift inside her chest, not the old love returning, not the anger flaring, but something new and strange and not entirely unwelcome. It was something like peace. She told him that she had already forgiven him, not for his sake but for her own, because carrying the weight of his betrayal was a burden she had decided she was no longer willing to bear. She told him that the road back to his children would be long and difficult and that it would require more than words, it would require consistent, patient, humble action over months and years, the kind of sustained commitment that he had failed to show in their marriage. She told him that she was not the same woman he had left buried in that kitchen, that the version of Corinne who had loved him so completely that she had ignored every warning sign and forgiven every slight and made excuses for every absence had died beneath that rubble alongside their marriage, and that the woman standing before him now was someone new, someone forged in the fire of survival, someone who had learned that her worth was not dependent on his love or anyone else's. And then she told him to go, not cruelly but firmly, and she closed the door, and she stood there for a moment in the quiet of her foyer, and she breathed. The months that followed that conversation brought a cautious and imperfect but genuine process of reconstruction, not of the marriage, which was finished, but of the family in its new and different form. Garrett began attending therapy on his own, working with a counselor who specialized in accountability and behavioral change, and he started the slow process of rebuilding his relationship with Margot and Theo. It was harder with Margot, who was old enough to understand what her father had done and who struggled with a fury that sometimes frightened her in its intensity. Theo, younger and more adaptable, was quicker to accept his father's supervised visits, though even he had moments of confusion and hurt that required careful, loving attention from the adults around him. Corinne did not interfere in this process, nor did she facilitate it beyond what was necessary. She had meant what she said to Garrett, the work of earning his children's trust was his to do, and she would neither help nor hinder it. For her own part, Corinne was building a life that she was beginning to recognize as genuinely and meaningfully her own. She returned to nursing, taking a position at a community health clinic that served low-income families, work that was demanding and emotionally taxing but that filled her with a sense of purpose that she had been missing for years without fully realizing it. She enrolled in a weekend art class on a whim, something she had wanted to do since college but had never made time for, and discovered in the act of putting paint to canvas a form of expression that was both meditative and liberating. She deepened her friendships with Bridget and Jeanette, with Rosamund, with Phoebe her physical therapist, with the other parents at Margot and Theo's schools, relationships that she had previously allowed to remain shallow because she had been so focused on her marriage that she had neglected the broader architecture of her social and emotional life. And on a warm afternoon in late spring, nearly 18 months after the earthquake, Corinne did something that surprised even herself. She drove to the site where their old house had stood. It had been demolished by then, the lot cleared and graded, a blank canvas of dirt and possibility, and she parked her car at the curb and got out and walked to the center of the empty lot and stood there in the afternoon sunlight. She stood on the approximate spot where her kitchen had been, where she had been trapped and broken and abandoned, and she looked up at the clear blue sky and she felt something that she had not expected to feel. She felt grateful. Not for the earthquake, not for the betrayal, not for the pain. She would never be grateful for those things, and anyone who suggested she should be had not earned the right to an opinion. But she was grateful for the person she had become in the aftermath, for the strength she had discovered in herself that she might never have known existed if she had not been forced to find it. She was grateful for the love of her children, her sisters, her mother, her community. She was grateful for the strangers who had donated money and time and kindness to a woman they had never met, simply because they believed that no one should have to face the worst moments of their life alone. She was grateful for the second chance that life had given her, not a second chance at marriage or romance, though she did not rule those things out for the future, but a second chance at living fully and authentically and on her own terms. She stood there for a long time, on that empty lot where her old life had ended and her new life had begun, and she let the warmth of the sun soak into her skin, and she closed her eyes, and she breathed deeply, and she let go. If this story touched your heart, if it made you think about the people in your life who have shown you what real love looks like, if it reminded you that the hardest chapters of our stories are often the ones that teach us the most about who we truly are, then please take a moment right now to like this video. Leave a meaningful comment below. Tell me about a time when you were knocked down and found the strength to get back up, or tell me about someone in your life who showed you what courage looks like. Share this story with someone who might need to hear it today, someone who might be going through their own earthquake, their own rubble, their own dark and terrifying night of the soul. And please, if you have not already, subscribe to our channel so that you never miss another one of these emotional journeys. Your support means more than you know, and every time you engage with these stories, you help them reach someone else who might be struggling, who might be wondering if things will ever get better, who might need to hear that they are not alone. Corinne Ashford went on to live a life that was richer and more expansive than anything she had imagined during those 19 hours buried beneath the rubble of her old home. Margot grew into a fierce and compassionate young woman who eventually studied journalism in college, driven by a belief that the truth, even when it is painful, has the power to change lives. Theo became an architect, drawn perhaps by some deep and unconscious desire to build things that could withstand whatever the world threw at them. Garrett remained on the periphery of their lives, a presence that was diminished but not entirely absent, a man who had been fundamentally changed by the consequences of his actions and who spent the rest of his life trying, with varying degrees of success, to be better than the person he had been on the worst day of his life. He never fully repaired his relationship with Margot, who carried a protective fierceness toward her mother that softened with time but never entirely disappeared. His relationship with Theo was warmer, more forgiving, shaped by the particular grace that children sometimes extend to the adults who have failed them, a grace that is not earned but freely given, like sunlight falling on ground that has done nothing to deserve it. And Corinne herself, Corinne who had been buried, Corinne who had been broken, Corinne who had been abandoned by the person who was supposed to love her most, Corinne became, in the quiet and unremarkable way that the most extraordinary transformations often happen, a woman who was whole. Not perfect. Not untouched by pain. Not free of scars, both physical and emotional. But whole. Complete in herself. Rooted in a love that did not depend on the faithfulness of any man but on the deep, unshakable knowledge that she was worthy of devotion and capable of surviving its absence. She kept painting. She kept nursing. She kept showing up for her children and her sisters and her mother and her community, kept pouring love into the world with the same stubborn, bone-deep commitment that she had learned from Lorraine and Gus all those years ago in Whitmore Falls. She did not become bitter. She did not become hard. She became, instead, something that is rarer and more beautiful than either of those things. She became free. On the second anniversary of the earthquake, Corinne woke early and made pancakes for Margot and Theo, and they ate together at the kitchen table of their rental house, which had by then become something more than a temporary arrangement, had become a home in the truest sense of the word, filled with art on the walls and laughter in the hallways and the accumulated evidence of a family that had been broken apart and had chosen, with deliberate and daily effort, to put itself back together in a new and stronger configuration. After breakfast, Margot went to her room to study and Theo went out to the backyard to kick a soccer ball, and Corinne carried her coffee to the front porch and sat in the rocking chair that Bridget had given her for her birthday and watched the morning light spread across the neighborhood like a slow and generous benediction. A hummingbird hovered at the feeder she had hung from the eave, its wings a blur of iridescent motion, and she watched it drink and thought about how strange and beautiful it was that the smallest things, a bird at a feeder, sunlight on a porch, the sound of a child laughing in a backyard, could feel so enormous when you had almost lost the chance to experience them. She thought about the woman she had been 2 years ago, standing in a different kitchen on a different morning, packing a lunch and humming along with the radio, unaware that her world was about to collapse around her in every possible sense. She thought about how far she had come since then, how many miles of pain and healing and difficult, unglamorous work lay between that woman and this one. And she thought about all the people who had walked alongside her on that journey, her sisters, her mother, her children, her therapist, her neighbors, and the vast, unnamed multitude of strangers who had sent their love and support across the distances and had refused, even though they had no obligation whatsoever, to let her face the darkness alone. She took a sip of her coffee and she smiled, and the smile was not performative or defensive or bittersweet but real, genuinely and simply real, the kind of smile that comes from a place so deep inside you that it feels less like an expression and more like an exhale, a release, a laying down of arms after a long and exhausting war. She was here. She was alive. She was whole. And the morning stretched out before her, wide and bright and full of the kind of ordinary, unheroic possibility that is, when you have earned the right to see it clearly, the most extraordinary gift the world has to offer. Please take a moment now, before you go, to leave a comment below. Tell me this: what does it mean to you to start over? What does rebuilding look like in your life? I would love to hear your story, your perspective, your heart. And if this story gave you something, hope, tears, a moment of reflection, please share it with someone else. You never know who might be standing in their own rubble right now, waiting for a sign that it is possible to emerge from the wreckage and find, on the other side, a life worth living. Subscribe to our channel, be part of our family, and remember always that no earthquake, whether it shakes the ground beneath your feet or the foundation of everything you believe to be true, no earthquake is powerful enough to destroy the human spirit when that spirit refuses to be broken.